Could we drop, please, culture warrior and divisive? I think they get us nowhere. There are two terms I want to talk about that I think are both extremely dysfunctional and get us nowhere, but boy, are they popular in the commentariat. The first one is culture warrior, and the second one is divisive. Now, culture warrior, I think, is especially a stupid and unilluminating term, and here's why. It's used almost exclusively by people on the left to excoriate people on the right. So if you're on the right and you're opposed to abortion on demand, you're opposed to gay marriage, you're in support of religious liberty, that sort of thing, well, then you're excoriated as a culture warrior. You're a rock'em sock'em, over and against kind of person. Well, I always smile when I read that because, I mean, the left, are you kidding? The left is just as much a culture warrior as the right. I mean, the left stands in favor of certain things in the culture, but the left is, gosh, radically against racism, against xenophobia, against homophobia, against environmental pollution. The left stands in a warlike attitude against all sorts of things in the culture. My point here is it's a term that gets us nowhere. It doesn't advance the argument in any way. It's simply a way of branding your opponent as a bad guy and signaling, I guess, your own virtue that, you stand above the fray. You're not a warrior. You're a person of peace. I mean, give me a break. Everybody, no matter what position you take, you're against something in the culture. And I think here, too, heroes of the left, heroes of mine, too, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day. I mean, culture warrior, you bet they were. Now, both of them advocated nonviolent ways of engaging the culture, but King stood as a mighty warrior against racism, against segregation, against the degradation of his own people and of minorities, and did so in a very confrontational way, nonviolently, but in a very confrontational way. Same with Dorothy Day. Talk about a hero of nonviolence, to be sure, but boy, did she take on racism and militarism and the violence of our culture. My point is, they're as much culture warriors as anybody on the right. And so again, my point is, the use of that term gets us nowhere. It applies just as much to the one who's using it pejoratively as anybody else. And so the desideratum here is not to stay at that level of essentially name-calling. We haven't gone much beyond the sixth grade playground when we're using terms like culture warrior to excoriate our opponents. Far, far better would be a return to real argument. Why don't we talk about these particular issues? So what about abortion? What about militarism? What about violence in our culture? What about, now take your pick. Whether it's excoriated by left or right, let's talk about the issue and not stay at the level of essentially name-calling. And that leads me to the second term, which I think is also comically ineffectual, let's say, in the public conversation. And that term is divisive. So invariably, people will say of their opponents, he's being divisive. How divisive of you? Well, look, there is a morally bad form of divisiveness. If it's born of hatred, if it's born of a desire to harm somebody, I've said many times that one of the devil's names, diabolos, means the scatterer. I mean, so if you really are in that attitude of hatred and violence trying to divide people, that's always a bad thing, quite right. But here's my point. Anytime you make a real argument, anytime you make a real intellectual judgment, you are ipso facto divisive. And I'll show that now with the help of Bernard Lonergan, the great Jesuit philosopher. So Lonergan said, the four great imperatives that should animate anyone seeking truth. First of all is to be attentive. So See what's going on. What are the data? Be attentive. Secondly, be intelligent, by which he meant form hypotheses, have bright ideas, come up with all kinds of interesting possible explanations for a given set of data. So think of a scientist, hypothesizing. Think of a philosopher looking at different patterns of meaning. Okay. But, says Lonergan, the third step in the process, beyond be intelligent, is be reasonable. And to be reasonable is to make a judgment, is to say, okay, of all these bright ideas, they're all interesting and intriguing, but there's one that's the right idea. There's one that's at least the relatively adequate explanation. So a scientist will do experiments to determine which of his bright hypotheses is in fact the right hypothesis. So a philosopher, having looked at a variety of patterns, will say, but I think that's the best way to explain a phenomenon. Here's the point. Anytime you make that move, you decide. And the word decide is from a Latin root, close to scissors, by the way, that means to cut. To cut. When you say, yeah, that's the right answer, you have necessarily cut off all the other hypotheses. You've said, I think those are inadequate. You've decided, you've made a judgment. And therefore, everybody, ipso facto, you have become divisive, because people who hold the other hypotheses are going to feel, well, I guess he doesn't like me. I guess he's decided against me. Well, yeah, at least he's decided against your proposal. Anytime you make a judgment, which is an advance in the direction of the truth, you are divisive. And now, Lonergan's fourth imperative is to be responsible. That means to accept the implications of the judgment you've made. If you say, yeah, this is the right decision, this is the right hypothesis, this is the right pattern of meaning, well now, accept that. Live up to it. And one way you live up to it, Lonergan thought, was to put up with people who are now going to start criticizing you. So if the minute you make a judgment and then you get criticism, you cave in, well, then you're not being responsible. So again, if you really have moved beyond the level of mere intelligence, you've come to real judgment and responsibility, you are ipso facto going to be divisive. Now, it doesn't mean the hateful kind of division. That's always bad. But this is a legitimate, inevitable type of divisiveness if you're really being intellectually responsible. Which is why very often in the commentary, when the term is thrown around, oh, what a divisive person. Oh, you're being so divisive. Well, yeah, if by that you mean I've made a real judgment, I've taken a real position, and I'm sticking with it responsibly. Well, that's nothing to be ashamed of. That's an inevitable consequence of being intellectually responsible. So, could we drop, please, culture warrior and divisive? I think they get us nowhere. They get us stuck at the level of basically name calling. What's always the desideratum is the return to argument. The return to argument. Make your case. Make your judgment. Try to convince your opponent. But getting stuck at this level of essentially name calling, it's a waste of time. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel.